She had been sitting in her small apartment for hours, staring at the invitation in her hands. It wasn't anything fancy, just a simple piece of paper with the details of a community event. A music festival, they called it. She almost tossed it aside. After all, she had played at events before, and most of the time people didn't really notice. The applause was polite but hollow, and the nods of approval never felt real. She had learned long ago not to expect too much. But something about this invitation made her pause. It wasn't that she believed this festival would change her life. She had been around long enough to know that big moments rarely came from small events. Yet, there was a line written on the bottom of the invitation that stayed in her mind. Your music has the power to touch hearts. It sounded cliché, almost laughable, but for some reason it struck a chord inside her. Maybe it was just the way her heart was aching that day, but she felt a pull, a tiny spark that whispered, maybe you should try. For weeks, her life had felt stuck. She had been practicing her music every day, yet the world outside her apartment seemed to ignore her. She had played in cafes, at open mics, and at small gatherings where people clapped politely and moved on with their lives. Sometimes she wondered if she was chasing a dream that would never come true. She loved music, yes, but love alone didn't make anyone notice you. The thought made her sigh. And yet, here she was, staring at the invitation as if it were a key to something she couldn't name. She remembered the day she first touched a piano. She was a child then, curious and wide-eyed. Her fingers had trembled as they pressed the keys, unsure of what to do, but even in those uncertain notes, she had felt alive. That feeling never went away. Music had been her companion through every lonely moment, every heartbreak, every victory small and large. And even when the world seemed to forget her, the piano never did. She set the invitation down and began to prepare in her mind. She had a few pieces she could play, ones that were safe and familiar. But she wondered if maybe she should try something new, something daring. Her fingers itched at the thought. She could feel the music inside her, waiting to come out, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a flutter of excitement. Maybe this wasn't just another performance. Maybe it was the one she had been waiting for, even if she didn't know it yet. As she packed her bag, she noticed how quiet the apartment was. The silence reminded her of how often she had felt invisible. She had people in her life, yes, but she had also spent years being overlooked, dismissed, or underestimated. There were teachers who told her she wouldn't succeed, peers who laughed at her dreams, and even family members who couldn't understand why she devoted so much time to music. It had left scars, ones that sometimes whispered doubts late at night. She paused in front of her mirror and looked at herself. Who was she really? Was she a musician destined to touch hearts, or just someone clinging to an old dream? The question hung in the air, heavy and uncomfortable. But she pushed it aside. There was no room for doubt now, not if she wanted to step onto that stage. The next day, she arrived at the festival venue early. The stage looked bigger than she had imagined, and the crowd had started to gather. She had expected a handful of people, maybe 50 at most, but when she looked around, she realized there were hundreds waiting. Her heart thumped against her chest. This was more than she had prepared for. Backstage, she tried to calm herself. She sat on a small bench, her fingers tracing the edge of the piano case she had brought with her. The sounds of other musicians warming up drifted in through the open doors. She could hear the strum of a guitar, the beat of a drum, and the soft hum of voices practicing. The music was comforting and terrifying at the same time. She felt small in the midst of it all, but she also felt a strange sense of belonging. She wasn't the only one who had ever been overlooked. She wasn't the only one trying to make herself heard. Her mind wandered to the audience she would face. She imagined their faces, some kind, some critical. She imagined the applause that might never come, or worse, the polite nods that felt empty. And yet she reminded herself that this wasn't about them. This was about the music. This was about the moment when her soul could speak through her fingers. She took a deep breath, closing her eyes, and let herself remember why she had started playing in the first place. Her nerves began to calm as she thought about the first song she would play. It was a piece she loved, one that had helped her through some of the darkest times. She imagined the melody flowing from her hands, filling the room, reaching people in ways words never could. She imagined someone out there hearing the music and feeling something real, something true. It gave her courage. The other musicians started finishing their sets, and soon it was her turn. She stood up, feeling the weight of the moment settle over her like a heavy coat. The stage looked enormous, and the lights seemed to spotlight her every move. Her stomach fluttered with anxiety, but she held her head high. She told herself, "You can do this. You have done this before. Just play." As she walked toward the piano, she noticed a few familiar faces in the crowd. People she hadn't seen in years, and some she hadn't expected to see at all. She froze for a moment, caught off guard. What were they doing here? Her heart raced, but she pushed the thought aside. This wasn't the time to dwell on the past. This was her moment. She sat down at the piano, adjusted the bench, and placed her hands on the keys. She took another deep breath. The first note she played was soft, tentative, like a question. She waited for the room to respond, for the music to find its way. And slowly, the melody began to grow. Her fingers moved with more confidence now, the music flowing like water. She could feel the tension in her shoulders melting as she lost herself in the sound. For a moment, the world outside didn't exist. There were no doubts, no fears, no past failures. There was only the music, and there was only her. Every note she played carried a piece of her story, her struggles, her hopes, her dreams, and the quiet strength she had built over the years. She felt alive in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. As if the music itself was reminding her who she really was. The audience listened in silence at first, some curious, some skeptical, but slowly their expressions began to change. They leaned forward, their eyes fixed on her hands, on the piano, on the music that seemed to speak directly to them. She didn't notice it yet, but the music was reaching them. Every note was a bridge between her world and theirs, and for the first time she felt seen. Not just for what she could do, but for who she was. By the time the first piece ended, the room was filled with a quiet energy. She lifted her head, surprised at the intensity of the moment. People were looking at her differently now, not just as a performer, but as someone who had poured her heart into every note. It was a feeling she had chased for years, and now it was finally here. Backstage, she allowed herself a small smile. This was just the beginning, she knew. The night was still ahead, and there would be challenges, moments of doubt, and opportunities to falter. But in this instant, she felt a spark of something bigger than herself. She felt hope. She realized that no matter what happened next, she had already changed. The invitation she almost ignored had brought her to a moment where she could truly be herself. And maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something she had been waiting for her whole life. She stepped off the backstage area and onto the stage. The lights were brighter than she expected, and the audience stretched far beyond what she had imagined. She froze for a moment, caught between excitement and fear. Hundreds of faces stared at her, some curious, some eager, and some looking so familiar that her heart skipped a beat. She had expected only strangers, people who would listen politely for a few minutes and then move on. But now she realized that among the crowd were people from her past, faces she hadn't seen in years, some of whom she hadn't thought she would ever see again. Her mind raced. She tried to focus on the music, on the keys beneath her fingers, but it was hard. The sight of those familiar faces brought back memories she had tried to bury. There was the music teacher who had scolded her for wasting time with music. There were classmates who had mocked her passion for playing the piano, calling it childish and useless. There were even distant relatives who had never understood why she spent hours practicing when she could have been doing something more practical. She felt the weight of all those judgments pressing on her shoulders, threatening to crush her confidence. She swallowed hard and took a deep breath. She reminded herself that she had worked hard to be here, that she had practiced countless hours, and that the music was hers to share. She couldn't let old fears or old faces control her. This was her moment. Slowly, she moved toward the piano, each step feeling heavier than the last. Her heart pounded, but she tried to steady her breathing, repeating in her mind, "Just play. Just play." Nothing else matters. As she sat down at the piano, she noticed a few people in the front row who seemed almost shocked to see her. Some whispered to each other, pointing subtly, and she realized that they recognized her. Recognition brought both fear and courage. She had always been invisible, overlooked, dismissed. Now, in one room full of people, she could not be ignored. The thought sent a shiver down her spine. Both thrilling and terrifying, she placed her fingers lightly on the keys, feeling the familiar grooves and edges. For a moment, her hands hesitated, unsure whether to start with the song she had prepared or to let her instincts guide her. She closed her eyes, letting the quiet of the theater settle over her. She listened to the murmurs of the audience, the soft rustle of clothes, the faint coughs, and tried to block it all out. Her mind slowly emptied, leaving only her hands, her heart, and the music. When she pressed the first key, the sound felt fragile, almost uncertain. She looked up, expecting some reaction, some polite nodding, but the audience was quiet. She felt a twinge of doubt. Had she imagined that spark of hope back in her apartment? Were they going to care at all? But then, as she continued, the music began to flow more naturally. Her fingers moved with confidence she hadn't felt in a long time. Each note seemed to find its place in the room, reaching out to touch invisible threads in the hearts of the listeners, the familiar faces in the crowd. Well, harder to ignore now. She saw the slight furrow of brows on some, the widening of eyes on others. Some seemed moved, though she couldn't tell if it was admiration, surprise, or something deeper. She tried to block out their expressions, focusing only on the music, letting it guide her, letting it speak what words could not. The melody grew stronger, bolder, and more expressive. She could feel it lifting her, carrying her beyond the stage, beyond her fears, beyond the doubts that had haunted her for years. As she played, flashes of memory came unbidden. She remembered practicing in the small living room of her childhood home, her fingers raw and sore while her parents argued in the next room. She remembered the nights she had stayed up, teaching herself pieces she couldn't afford to learn formally, learning from books and recordings, piecing together her own education. She remembered the quiet evenings when she had wondered if anyone would ever notice, if anyone would ever care. And now, as she played, all of those memories seemed to give her strength rather than weaken her. They were a part of her, and they belonged here on this stage. Slowly, she realized that she was no longer just performing. The music had become a conversation, a connection between her and the people in the audience. Every note she played seemed to reach someone's heart. She could feel it in the subtle reactions, the quick intake of breath, the way some people leaned forward as if to catch every sound, the tears that glimmered in a few eyes. She had never experienced anything like this before. It was as if the music was breaking through invisible walls, touching emotions she had only hoped could be reached. The familiar faces in the front row were watching her with intensity. Some looked proud, some seemed astonished, and some had expressions she couldn't quite read. She had spent so long imagining that her past judgments would define her, but in that moment she realized that the audience didn't matter in the way she had feared. What mattered was the music, and how it could speak for her when words were not enough. Her hands began to move faster, more confidently. The melody took on a new energy, full of emotion and life. She felt the rhythm in her bones, in her chest, and in her very soul. The music seemed to carry her beyond herself, beyond the stage, beyond the small fears that had kept her from believing in her own power. She could feel the audience responding, but she didn't need their approval. She had already found her own strength in the music, in the act of sharing it without hesitation, without fear. As the first piece came to an end, she hesitated before moving to the next. The audience remained quiet, as if they were holding their breath, waiting for what she would do next. She looked up and noticed that the room had changed. People were leaning forward, completely absorbed in the performance. She could see the curiosity and anticipation in their eyes. It was a strange feeling, being seen in a way she had never truly been seen before. It was as if the music had opened a door, and now they were standing on the threshold, waiting to enter her world. She closed her eyes again, letting the music guide her to the next piece. This one was more daring, more expressive, more personal. She had never played it in public before, but something inside her demanded it. Her fingers flew across the keys, each note carrying a piece of her story, her struggles, her hopes, her fears, and her dreams. The audience responded in subtle ways, some nodding, some smiling, some visibly moved. She could feel the energy in the room, the invisible connection forming between her and the people who had come to listen. In that moment, she realized something important. She had always feared being seen, feared being judged, feared failing in front of others. But the music had freed her from that fear. It didn't matter what people thought of her. What mattered was that she was being true to herself, that she was expressing what she had carried inside for so long. And for the first time, she felt a deep sense of peace. She belonged here. She had always belonged here. As she finished the second piece, a hush fell over the room. The silence was almost unbearable, but in that silence, she felt something shift. The audience was no longer just a crowd of strangers or familiar faces. They were witnesses. Witnesses to her journey, to her struggles, to her courage in stepping onto the stage despite everything she had faced. And in that moment, she understood that this was why she had come. This was why she had accepted the invitation she almost ignored. This was why she had spent years practicing, honing her craft, and believing in herself even when no one else did. For the first time in a long while, she felt truly alive. She felt seen, not in the shallow way of applause or recognition, but in the deep, human way that comes when someone opens their heart and shares it without reservation. She had stepped onto the stage expecting a small performance, and what she found instead was a connection, a recognition, and a validation she had never anticipated. As she prepared for the next piece, she took a deep breath and smiled to herself. The night was far from over, and there would be more challenges, more pieces to play, and more moments to face. But she felt ready. She felt strong. And most importantly, she felt that she was exactly where she was meant to be. She took a deep breath, letting the applause from the last piece settle into her chest. It was polite at first, but she could feel it growing, spreading through the room like a warm current. Something had changed. The audience wasn't just listening anymore, they were watching her, waiting for the next notes to spill from her fingers. She had been performing for years, but she had never felt anything like this. It was as if the room itself was holding its breath, leaning closer, waiting for her story to continue. Her hands hovered over the piano keys, trembling slightly. She had chosen this next piece carefully. It was one she had never played in public, a song that carried the weight of her deepest memories. Each note was personal, every melody a reflection of moments that had shaped her life, moments of struggle, moments of hope, and moments of quiet triumph that no one had ever seen. As her fingers touched the keys, the room seemed to grow quieter, as if the audience could sense the intimacy of what was about to unfold. The first few notes were soft, tentative, almost fragile. She felt the familiar nerves creeping back, but she pushed them aside. She reminded herself that the music was not about perfection, it was about truth. And this piece, more than any other, allowed her truth to speak. The melody wove through the room like a thread, gentle at first, then growing stronger, carrying emotion with it. Every note was a part of her soul, and as she played, she felt herself becoming fully immersed, fully alive. As the music filled the hall, she noticed subtle reactions in the audience. Some leaned forward, their eyes wide, as if trying to catch every nuance. Some closed their eyes, letting the sound wash over them. And then, slowly, she began to recognize faces that she had thought would never appear in her life again. There were people who had doubted her when she was young, who had told her that music was a waste of time. There were faces of teachers, old classmates, and acquaintances who had once laughed at her ambitions. And yet they were here now, watching her, listening to her, and perhaps seeing her for the first time. Her hands moved faster, more confidently, as the music took on a life of its own. It was no longer just a song, it was a conversation, a connection between her and everyone in the room. She felt a strange energy, a current that moved through her fingers, through the piano, and out into the audience. She could sense their emotions shifting, a quiet ripple moving through the crowd. Some were moved, some surprised, and some seemed to be holding back tears. She didn't know who they were, and she didn't need to. All that mattered was the connection that had formed. Invisible yet undeniable, the memories she had carried for years began to surface more vividly. She remembered nights when she had practiced alone, frustrated and exhausted, wondering if anyone would ever notice. She remembered the quiet moments of doubt when she questioned her own talent and wondered if it was worth continuing. She remembered the small victories too, the first time she mastered a difficult piece. The moment someone complimented her playing genuinely, the tiny sparks of encouragement that had kept her going. And now, as she played, all those memories seemed to merge with the present, giving her strength and clarity. She could feel the tension in the room growing, the collective focus of the audience sharpening. It was a strange sensation, being so visible, so exposed, yet feeling completely supported by the energy around her. She realized that this was more than a performance, it was a shared experience. Every note she played carried a piece of her story, and every person listening became a part of that story as well. The music was no longer hers alone. It belonged to everyone in the room, and they belonged to it. Her fingers danced across the keys, finding patterns and rhythms that seemed to emerge naturally, guided by emotion rather than memory. The piece was longer and more complex than anything she had attempted in public, but she didn't falter. She had spent years practicing, not just the notes but the feeling behind them. She had learned to play not only with her hands but with her heart, and now that training was paying off in a way she had never imagined. As she continued, she noticed subtle changes in the audience. Some faces were clearly moved, some were astonished, and others seemed almost speechless. She could see the slight catching of breath, the widening of eyes, the hands pressed lightly against mouths in awe. It was a feeling she had rarely experienced. Validation, yes, but deeper than that, recognition. Recognition of her talent, her dedication, and perhaps even her courage in standing there, sharing herself so openly. Then something unexpected happened. She looked up for a moment, glancing at the crowd, and her eyes landed on someone in the back of the hall. She froze. She didn't recognize him at first, but then her heart skipped a beat. It was someone she hadn't seen in years. Someone who had played a pivotal role in her life, someone who had believed in her when others didn't. Seeing him there, standing quietly, watching intently, filled her with a mix of emotions, shock, gratitude, and an almost overwhelming sense of connection. Her fingers faltered for a moment, but she quickly regained control, letting the music guide her. The melody became more intense, more expressive, as if it were speaking directly to him, directly to everyone who had doubted her, and directly to herself. She realized that this was the moment she had been waiting for all her life, the moment when her music would be heard. Truly heard by people who mattered, and even by people who had once seemed impossible to impress. The piece reached a crescendo, each note louder and more powerful than the last. She could feel the energy in the room building, a wave of emotion that seemed to lift her off the stage. The audience was completely captivated now, not just by her technical skill, but by the emotion, the vulnerability and the honesty she was putting into every note. For the first time, she realized that music had the power to change more than just moods. It could reach hearts, open minds, and even transform relationships. Her mind wandered briefly to the people who had doubted her, the faces of those who had laughed or dismissed her dreams. And instead of anger or resentment, she felt something surprising, a quiet triumph, a sense of peace. She didn't need their approval anymore. She had found her own voice, and it was stronger than she had ever imagined. The music itself had become her validation, her proof, and her message to the world. As the final notes of the piece rang out, she held them for a moment, letting the sound linger in the hall. The audience remained silent, as if afraid to break the spell. And then, slowly, the first applause began, soft but genuine. It grew steadily, filling the room with a warmth that made her heart swell. She looked out at the faces in the crowd, and for the first time, she felt completely understood. Tears prickled at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She smiled instead, a small, quiet smile of triumph and relief. She had faced her fears, confronted her past, and shared herself with the world in a way she had never thought possible. And now, as the applause continued, she felt a sense of connection, of validation, and of joy that she had never experienced before. As she prepared for the next piece, She felt a deep sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the music that had carried her through years of doubt, for the audience that had opened their hearts, and for the chance to finally be seen, truly seen, for who she was. She had walked onto the stage expecting nothing, and what she had found was everything she had ever hoped for and more. She realized that this was more than a performance, it was a turning point. The moment had changed her, not just as a musician, but as a person. She had discovered a strength and courage she didn't know she possessed, and she had experienced a connection with others that went beyond words. And as she lifted her hands to begin the next piece, she knew that this was only the beginning of a journey that would continue long after the final note had faded. She paused for a moment, letting the echoes of the last piece fade into silence. The audience was still, their attention fixed entirely on her. She could feel the energy in the room, a mix of curiosity, anticipation, and something deeper, something she couldn't yet name. Her heart was racing, but she no longer felt nervous in the same way. The nerves had transformed into focus, into a kind of quiet determination that made her feel powerful in a way she had never experienced before. She looked at the piano, then at the audience, and realized that this was her moment, the point where everything could change. She had played carefully before, following the notes she had memorized, sticking to pieces she knew she could handle. But now she felt a sudden impulse to play from her heart, to let the music flow freely, without hesitation, without fear. She wanted to show the audience not just her skill, but the emotion, the life, the story that she carried inside. Her fingers touched the keys gently at first, producing a soft, tentative melody. The audience leaned in, sensing the intimacy of the moment. She closed her eyes and let the music guide her, letting it rise and fall naturally. The notes were no longer just sounds, they were expressions of her life, her struggles, her hopes, and her dreams. Every chord carried a part of her story that she had never been able to say in words. As she played, she felt something shift in the room. The audience was no longer simply watching, they were feeling. She could sense it in the quiet, in the way people leaned forward, in the small gasps and murmurs that escaped as the music touched something deep inside them. She realized that the music had become a bridge, connecting her to each person in the hall, allowing them to understand, to empathize, and to share in her emotions. Then, unexpectedly, something happened that made her pause. In the back of the room, a man stood up. At first, she didn't recognize him, but as she looked closer, her breath caught in her throat. It was someone from her past, someone she had never expected to see again. He was watching her intently, eyes wide, a look of astonishment and recognition on his face. She froze for a moment, her fingers hovering over the keys. The intensity of his gaze was almost overwhelming, but it also gave her a strange sense of courage. The music had taken on a new energy now, almost as if it had sensed the presence of this person. Her hands moved faster, more confidently, more boldly. She allowed herself to play the pieces that she had always been afraid to play, the melodies that carried the weight of her deepest emotions. The piano seemed to respond to her feelings, each note richer, more vibrant, more alive than before. The audience felt it too. They were leaning in, captivated, hanging on every sound dot as she continued. She noticed a few more people shifting in their seats, whispering to each other, pointing subtly. Some of them seemed to recognize her, while others seemed shocked by the depth of her performance. The room was charged with an energy she had never experienced before, a collective awareness that something extraordinary was happening. Her fingers danced across the keys, producing sounds that were no longer just music, but expressions of her very soul. Her mind flashed back to the countless hours she had spent practicing alone, to the times she had felt invisible, dismissed, or underestimated. She remembered the doubts, the struggles, the sacrifices, and the endless nights of persistence. And now, in this moment, all of that effort was coming to life. She realized that everything she had endured had led her to this stage, to this performance, to this connection with an audience that seemed to see her truly for the first time. The intensity of the music grew. She felt herself becoming completely absorbed, moving with a rhythm that felt both natural and transcendent. The audience was completely silent now, not a single cough, not a single movement to break the spell. She could feel their emotions as if they were waves flowing through the room, washing over her, filling her with a sense of purpose and understanding she had never known. And then it happened, the moment that changed everything. She reached a part of the piece that she had never played for anyone before, a melody that carried a story of pain and hope, of struggle and triumph. As she played the final haunting notes, the audience reacted in a way she had never imagined. There were gasps, tears, and expressions of shock and awe. Some people covered their mouths, unable to contain their emotions, while others simply sat frozen, staring in disbelief. She could feel the power of the music reaching into every heart in the room. Her eyes widened as she looked up and noticed something she hadn't seen before. People were standing, slowly at first, then more confidently, as if compelled by the music itself. The energy in the room was electric. She realized that this performance was no longer about her alone. It had become a shared experience. Something bigger than herself, something that had the power to move and transform everyone present. The man in the back of the room remained standing, his expression a mixture of pride, amazement, and deep emotion. She recognized now why he had come. He had been the first person to believe in her when no one else did. Seeing him there, witnessing the impact of her music, filled her with a sense of validation she had never known. It was as if the universe itself had conspired to bring this moment to life, to show her that her persistence, her courage, and her passion had not been in vain. Her fingers continued to move across the keys, guided by a force she couldn't explain. Each note was more expressive than the last, each chord more powerful, more honest. She could feel the audience's emotions merging with her own, creating a connection so intense it was almost tangible. It was as if the room itself had become alive, responding to the music, reacting to the story she was telling through every note. As the final chords rang out, she held them for a long moment, letting the sound linger, letting the silence that followed be as meaningful as the music itself. The audience was still, completely absorbed in the aftermath of what they had just witnessed. And then, slowly, the applause began. At first it was soft, hesitant, almost reverent. But then it grew, spreading through the hall like a wave, becoming louder, more heartfelt, more genuine. She looked up, tears in her eyes, and saw the expressions on the faces around her. Shock, admiration, awe, and a deep emotional connection that was almost overwhelming. She had stepped onto the stage expecting a simple performance, and now she realized she had created something far greater, a moment that would stay with people long after the music had ended. Her heart swelled with gratitude. Gratitude for the music that had carried her here, for the audience that had opened themselves to her, and for the courage she had found within herself to play with honesty and emotion. She had faced her fears, confronted her past, and shared her deepest self, and the result was more powerful than she had ever imagined. As she slowly rose from the piano, she felt a sense of peace and accomplishment she had never known. The applause continued, echoing through the hall, and she realized that this moment would stay with her forever. She had walked onto the stage, unsure of herself, hesitant and anxious, and she was leaving it transformed. The music had not only touched the audience, it had changed her, solidifying her belief in her own power, talent, and resilience. She took a final bow, letting the audience's energy wash over her one last time. This was more than a performance. It was a turning point, a revelation, a moment that would define her journey for years to come. And as she stepped away from the piano, she knew that her life had changed forever. She had not only played music, she had touched hearts, including her own. The final notes had faded, and the room was filled with a silence that felt almost sacred. She sat at the piano for a moment longer, letting the energy of the audience, the vibrations of the music, and the emotions of the night settle around her. She could feel her heart still racing, her hands slightly trembling. But it wasn't fear anymore. It was something entirely different. It was the exhilaration of knowing that she had given everything she had and that it had been received, truly received, by everyone in the room. Slowly, she rose from the piano bench. The applause had grown, a wave of sound that filled the hall, surrounding her, lifting her spirit. She looked out at the audience, and her eyes swept across the sea of faces. Some familiar, some strangers, all united in the moment she had created. She felt a strange warmth, a connection she could not fully describe. It was as if every person in the room had witnessed not just her performance, but a piece of her soul. Walking off the stage, she realized something profound. The fear she had carried with her for so many years, the fear of being judged, a failing of being overlooked, had disappeared. It was replaced by a quiet confidence, one that was not loud or boastful, but steady and strong. She had faced her doubts head-on and found that they could not touch her here. She had learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. And tonight she had chosen courage. Backstage, the musicians who had played before her were gathering their instruments, talking quietly among themselves. Some glanced at her, and she noticed the admiration in their eyes. She had played with an honesty and depth that went beyond technique, and they could sense it. She felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that her music had made a mark, that it had reached beyond the surface to touch something deeper. Her mind drifted back to the man in the back of the room, the one who had stood during her performance. He had been the first to believe in her, the one who had encouraged her when she doubted herself. She wondered if he understood the impact of his presence tonight. Seeing him there had given her courage in ways she couldn't fully explain. It had reminded her that sometimes all it takes is one person to believe in you for your world to change. The applause continued to grow louder, and she realized the audience wasn't ready to let go. People were on their feet now, clapping and cheering, and she felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization of how far she had come. She had walked onto this stage uncertain, nervous, and hesitant, expecting nothing more than polite acknowledgement. Instead, she had found connection, recognition, and a validation she had never known she needed. As she stepped away from the piano, she began to notice people approaching her. Some came forward with tears in their eyes, others with wide smiles, and a few simply nodded in silent appreciation. They didn't need words. The music had spoken for her. She felt humbled and grateful, knowing that her performance had reached them in ways she could never have anticipated. This was the power of music, its ability to speak what words could not. To connect hearts without explanation, she walked through the hall, feeling the warmth of the audience's energy brush against her like a soft breeze. Every person she passed seemed to carry a spark of emotion, a quiet acknowledgement of the journey she had shared with them through her music. She realized that this performance was no longer just a moment in time. It was a memory, a shared experience that would live on in the hearts of everyone present. She felt a sense of peace, knowing that she had not only given herself fully, but had also created something lasting. Her thoughts turned inward as she reflected on the path that had led her here. The countless hours of practice, the doubts, the setbacks, and the quiet moments of perseverance had all been worth it. She had learned lessons that went far beyond music, lessons about patience, resilience, and the importance of believing in oneself. The stage had become a mirror, reflecting not only her talent but also her growth, her courage, and the depth of her spirit. As the evening continued, people continued to approach her, sharing their gratitude, their amazement, and their emotions. Some spoke of memories her music had stirred, others of feelings they could not put into words. She listened quietly, her heart full, realizing that this was the true reward of her performance. It was not fame, not recognition, not even applause. It was the connection, the impact, and the shared human experience she had created. She paused for a moment to take it all in, standing quietly at the side of the stage. The room had changed since she had first stepped onto it. It felt alive, vibrant, and full of emotion. And in that moment, she understood that she had changed too. She had stepped into a space of uncertainty and fear, and she was leaving it with a renewed sense of purpose, confidence, self-belief. She had found her voice, and it would continue to guide her in ways she had never imagined. As she finally walked toward the exit, she looked back at the stage one last time. The piano stood there silently, as if resting after sharing in the journey. She felt a deep sense of gratitude toward it. It had been her partner, her voice, and her bridge to the hearts of those in the audience. She realized that music was not just an art. It was a language, a connection, a way to touch souls and change lives. And tonight she had spoken that language fluently, honestly, and beautifully. Outside the hall, the cool night air greeted her like a gentle embrace. She paused, taking a deep breath, and allowed herself to smile. The journey was far from over, and there would be new challenges, new doubts, and new opportunities. But she felt ready for them now, armed with the knowledge that she had the courage, the skill, and the heart to face whatever came next. She had discovered a truth that would stay with her forever, that sharing one's true self, fully and without fear, could create moments that change lives, including her own, walking down the quiet street. She replayed the evening in her mind, the faces, the applause, the energy, and the profound moments of connection. She thought about the people who had doubted her, the setbacks she had endured, and the long road she had traveled to arrive at this point. And instead of bitterness or regret, she felt gratitude. Gratitude for the challenges that had shaped her, for the perseverance that had carried her through, and for the courage that had allowed her to embrace this moment fully. She knew that this night would remain with her forever, a turning point in her life and in her journey as a musician. The experience had changed her perspective, deepened her understanding of herself, and reaffirmed her belief in the power of authenticity, vulnerability, and courage. She realized that the stage was more than a platform. It was a space where hearts could meet, where stories could be shared, and where human connections could be forged in ways words alone could never achieve. As she finally reached her home, she paused at the door, reflecting on everything she had experienced. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the lessons she had learned, and the moments of fear and doubt she had overcome. And she felt a quiet joy, a sense of completion, and a readiness for the future. She had walked onto the stage uncertain and hesitant, but she was leaving it empowered, transformed, and full of hope. The experience had taught her something she would carry forever, that true success is not measured by applause, recognition, or validation from others, but by the courage to embrace one's own truth and share it with the world. She had done that tonight, and the impact had been profound, not only for the audience but for herself. She had stepped into her own power, and in doing so, she had discovered the true magic of music, its ability to heal, to connect, and to inspire. As she closed her eyes that night, she could still hear the echoes of the music, the faces of the audience, and the warmth of the shared experience. She felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that she had honored her journey, her talent, and her heart. She had faced fear, embraced vulnerability, and allowed herself to be truly seen. And in that act, she had not only changed the lives of those who had listened, but she had also changed herself forever. She lay down, feeling the exhaustion of the night settling over her, but it was a satisfying exhaustion, one born of courage, authenticity, and human connection. For the first time in a long time, she felt completely whole, completely seen, and completely alive. The stage had shown her something that no amount of practice, doubt, or hesitation could ever teach, that when you share your true self with the world, even in a single moment, it can create ripples that last a lifetime.